King sits behind a velvet screen, listening for a confession that never comes. Sheets of court letters whisper like moth wings. In Spain's palaces, the quiet is louder than drums, and secrets grow teeth. Tonight we open the sealed box of Ferdinand VII, his jealous vows, his desperate marriages, his bargains in shadowed rooms, so we can ask why these scandals keep breathing under the crown's gold. Before we step into these forgotten corridors of survival and suffering, please tap like and subscribe for more hidden histories. Tell me where you're listening from in the comments. I love that we can stand together across time and distance, bound by curiosity.
The boy was taught to walk as if the floor were a witness. In the cold stone of El Escorial, young Ferdinand learned to keep his face folded like a sealed letter, his thoughts braided tightly as a cord around a reliquary. Courtiers studied him for fractures. He studied them for leverage. His father, King Charles IV, smiled with a hunted man's warmth, and his mother, Maria Luisa, ruled the temperature of rooms with a glance. Manuel Godoy, the favourite, shimmered through the chambers like a dangerous perfume, always near, always needed, always blamed. The boy watched. He learned that affection bent like metal when heated by power, and that a promise could be hammered into any shape. He was the Prince of Asturias, yet he felt like a guest at his own table. Tutors taught him kingship as a catechism. Obey, persist, appear inevitable. But the boy collected injuries, a slight at dinner, a withheld audience, a rumour that he was weak, until the injuries became armour. He kept a secret ledger in his heart. Godoy's smirk, his mother's laughter, the way servants knelt more quickly when the favourite entered. The prince decided he would become the one thing none of them expected: patient. At night, he listened to monks chanting in the basilica, each note a nail whispered into the wood of a future throne. He did not yet know the price of patience. He only knew that Godoy had to fall, and that a son could set a house on fire while claiming to save it. Ferdinand's first strategy was silence. His second was friendship forged in whispers. He gathered a ring of confidants who loved Spain more than they loved the favourite. They met in poorly warmed rooms, where breath misted and conspiracies ripened like fruit hidden from the frost. It was less a plot than a patience, an agreement to hold one rope and pull when the right bell sounded. They traded scraps of information, a minister's grievance, a noble's unpaid debt, a chamberlain's slighted cousin, all threads they could tie around Godoy's ankles. The prince wrote letters without ink, phrases rehearsed, sworn aloud and then swallowed, because paper could betray a man faster than a friend. His loyalty to his father stiffened like a ceremonial cape. To his mother, it cooled to a careful bow. Toward Godoy, his face learned a theatre of gratitude. The young men around him practiced the same art, growing fluent in the language of the unsaid. They called their restraint patriotism and their ambition duty, and perhaps for a season those words were not lies. One winter, a monk with a soldier's hands taught Ferdinand a prayer for fortitude. The prince repeated it each dawn until the words shed their holiness and became a blade. He understood that power was a science of timing. Strike too soon and you become a traitor. Strike too late and you become a memory. So he waited for an earthquake he could claim as providence. The first wife, Maria Antonia of Naples, arrived with a prayer book and a reputation for nerves. She was clever enough to hide her cleverness, which was the only cleverness that survived long in Madrid. She saw through curtains, through courtiers, through the performance of piety that retained the odour of fear. With Ferdinand she was kind, and with the favourite she was icicle polite. The court measured their marriage like apothecaries. Each glance weighed like grains of powder. When illness visited her, it carried a rumour on its back. When she failed to recover, malice found the shape of a story. The palace began to murmur that poison travels best in a silver spoon. The accusation was never named in daylight. only nodded toward in corridors and turned over like a coin in private rooms. Ferdinand learned that grief and suspicion ferment the same way. Both need darkness, both require patience, both end stronger than they began. He made a vow before a small image of the Virgin that he would not forget who laughed on the day of his wife's final fever. After the funeral, bells sobbed over the city. Godoy stood with courteous solemnity, and Ferdinand counted the seconds between the favourites' sighs. A widower now, the prince carried his sorrow like a badge and his blame like a blade wrapped in cloth. The court felt the temperature drop. Spain inhaled. Aranjuez thawed in the early spring of 1808, and with the thaw came the crack of branches under running feet. The mutiny began like a prayer shouted through a keyhole, angry, muffled, and unstoppable. Crowds surged toward Godoy's house, soldiers suddenly discovering the people's will, nobles discovering their courage. The favourites' doors splintered, and the prince's patience bloomed like a bruise becoming visible. Ferdinand did not strike the first blow, but when the bell he had waited for finally rang, he grasped the rope with both hands. The royal family fractured into glare and shadow. Charles IV faltered. Maria Luisa wept and cursed. Ferdinand stepped forward with a righteous son's face, brimming with a loyalty edged like a dagger. He demanded Godoy's fall as if it were mercy rather than punishment. Hands dragged the favourite from a hiding place. The crowd tasted triumph, discovering that a man, even a powerful man, is only bone and breath. The walls of the palace learned new words that week: abdication, transfer, necessity. Ferdinand imagined himself crowned by heaven for his obedience to Spain. He did not yet recognize the shape of the trap beneath him, or the fingers arranging it in France. Bayonne was a polite room full of traps. Napoleon received kings the way a falcon receives smaller birds, patiently, with interest that looked like admiration. Papers lay like snares on the table. Charles abdicated. Ferdinand consented. Signatures nested like knives. The prince who had believed patience a virtue now felt its iron turn in his mouth. He was not a king, but a pawn invited to shake hands with the board. France kept him gilded and confined. Valencay's gardens smelled of lemon and defeat. Ferdinand learned to smile in 2 languages and to flatter the jailer with the elegance of a guest. Letters from Spain arrived like messages from a house on fire. The French, the resistance, the Cortes in Cádiz. The birth of a constitution that named him without needing him. He walked the gravel paths and plotted a return that would look like destiny and feel like salvage. He rehearsed forgiveness as a gesture and revenge as a calendar. If Spain wanted him, he would be the deseado, the desired, draped in absolution, arm raised against the chaos that excused its own hunger. He practiced the pose by moonlight, chin lifted, hand open, eyes damp with gratitude. He understood that when a man returns from captivity, he may bring his chains back as decorations. He came back in 1814 to streets that smelled of triumph and ashes. Spain welcomed him like rain after siege, and Ferdinand, crowned by longing, stepped into the part he had written in the gardens of Valencay. He touched the Constitution as if testing a blade with his thumb, then cast it aside with theatrical sorrow, promising order where liberty had made men too loud. The deseado became the absolutist, and those who had toasted his return learned that hope is a hireling easily dismissed. Prisons thickened with talkers. The censors sharpened their knives on pamphlets. Ferdinand met with confessors and policemen and found that they prayed in the same tone. He married again, choosing piety like a strategy. Maria Josefa Amalia of Saxony entered the palace with a face like an icon and a heart that trembled at the noise of politics. Ferdinand mistook gentleness for compliance and chastity for cure. Court gossip described a marriage chaperoned by caution, where propriety sat between them like a third person. Meanwhile, the king cultivated shadows. private hours, private couriers, private debts. He congratulated himself on the elegance of secrecy, forgetting that secrets are not doors, but mirrors. A man eventually recognizes only the face he is trying to hide. An empty cradle haunted the palace more than any scandal. The future requires an heir, and the silence in the nursery sounded like fate clearing its throat. Doctors prescribed discretion and patience. Confessors prescribed prayer. The king prescribed hope like a medicine with a royal seal. Maria Josefa Amalia, devout and tender, carried her piety like armor. She wanted to be a good queen and a good wife and a good daughter of the church, and these good things jostled each other like pilgrims pressing toward a shrine. Ferdinand discovered that disappointment shapes a man faster than victory. He compensated with control, rearranging ministers, drafting decrees, moving confidence like chess pieces whose faces he could not remember. He told himself that God had delayed him only to sharpen his gratitude. In truth, delay sharpened his temper. Servants learned to vanish before it struck. Courtiers learned to survive by saying yes in new accents. The queen's health faltered. Her prayers lengthened. The king visited less, then more, then less again, afraid of the echo in the nursery. In time, death came for Maria Josefa as gently as a candle guttering. The queen left an absence that multiplied itself in every corridor. A palace learns men's desires the way a harbour learns the shape of ships. After the funeral, a new silence rubbed against the doors, and with it came visitors who knew how to keep secrets. The king's private hours grew braided with companionship, offered in half-lit rooms. Names slipped through the palace like ribbons, a lady-in-waiting whose eyes suggested absolution, a widow with a laugh like mercy, a singer invited to perform and then to remain. Whether rumour embroidered truth or truth embroidered rumour hardly mattered. The embroidery was what people saw. Ferdinand thought tenderness a remedy. He misread appetite as solace, and believed that the heart, if fed gently, would forget its hunger for an heir. Meanwhile, letters sharpened in distant provinces, soldiers grumbled, exiles plotted across borders. In the king's chambers, time flowed like warm wine. Beyond the windows, it clanged like iron. The crown survives its wearer by insisting on tomorrow, but a man lives only today. Ferdinand postponed hard choices, spoiling himself with small permissions. He did not notice how often the door behind him remained ajar. When the army coughs, a kingdom takes its temperature. Spain's officers began to sound hoarse with complaint. They wanted pay, clarity, a cause. The king offered edicts and surveillance. In taverns, in barracks, in the thickets of exile letters, the word liberal collected courage like kindling. A pronunciamiento cracked the air, then another, and the king discovered that secrecy does not stop a storm. It merely makes the windows rattle. In this pressure, Ferdinand sought a solution that felt like grace. Marriage again, this time to Maria Christina of the two Sicilies, young, politically supple, and he hoped, fertile. She arrived with a serenity studied in a difficult childhood. She could listen without blinking, and she could arrange a room with one sentence. The palace exhaled, sensing order. Maria Christina brought competence in her skirts, reorganized households, carefully chosen allies, a talent for transforming gossip into loyalty. She did not try to change the king's nature. She simply redirected its consequences. When she laughed softly, ministers who had intended to dissent found themselves agreeing. Ferdinand saw in her a harbour and in her patience a wager, that tomorrow could yet be built. An heir's first breath can rewrite a nation. When the infant Isabella cried, the palace cried with her. Servants blessed themselves. Courtiers rehearsed loyalty. The king felt a knot in his chest loosen. The queen measured her words like a physician. Carefully, in doses that heal. Ferdinand, older now and often unwell, found himself thinking in circles that always ended with the child's name. Isabella. Isabella. A bell that promised the future would ring in a lighter tone. But the old laws were iron, and iron remembers its mould. The salictangle of succession gnashed its teeth in back rooms. Some said a daughter could inherit, others said a brother must. In the clatter, Ferdinand reached for the Pragmatic Sanction, like a man grabbing a railing on a moving staircase. Enemies christened themselves with an old title, Carlists, and polished their grievances until they shone like doctrine. The king kissed his daughter's brow and understood that love makes a better promise than power. Yet power requires signatures, soldiers, and sermons. He signed. Soldiers shifted. Sermons followed. The king's body began writing its own decrees. Fevers scheduled audiences. Pain revised timetables. Strength drafted apologies. Maria Christina managed the kingdom as one manages a convalescent room. Quietly, effectively, with an ear for every footfall. Ferdinand, who had once worshipped control, discovered that control now worshipped distance. He dictated fewer letters and measured out his rage like a costly spice he could no longer afford. In this dimmed season, the past returned in the form of warnings. Priests brought absolution, ministers brought lists, doctors brought limits. The king brought memory, Godoy's sly smile, Bayonne's paper traps, Valencay's gravel paths, Maria Josefa's quiet prayers, Maria Christina's steady gaze, Isabella's laugh like water over stone. He realized that scandal is not a single deed, but an echo, and that the rooms of the palace were tuned to repeat him. He fussed over the child's education, insisted on a gentler tutor, then forgot why he had insisted. The Queen intercepted quarrels, rescued documents from drafts, and turned rancor into policy. Outside, Carlist preachers practiced indignation. Inside, the king practiced endurance. At the end, the palace listened as if to rain on a distant roof. Ferdinand's breath shortened. Ministers waited in a foyer that smelled of wax and worry. Maria Christina moved from room to room with a steadiness that invited obedience. The king asked for the child, and Isabella toddled in, then was carried out when the gravity of the room pressed too hard on her little chest. He signed once more where the queen pointed, the signature like a rope thrown across a river already in flood. He spoke not of Godoy or Bayonne, but of doors, how some open inward, and if you pull too hard you cannot enter. He confessed to no crime, named no names, offered no apologies. Yet his last look seemed to ask a favour of posterity, to remember him as a man trapped in the costume of a king. The crown, which had always wanted tomorrow, leaned toward Maria Christina and the child. The past settled onto Ferdinand like a cloak too heavy for summer. When the bells began, they were soft. The city lifted its face to listen. The proclamation of the little queen did not silence the bells of grievance. In monasteries where candles tunneled down into their own wax, old monks rehearsed older laws and found in them the shape of Don Carlos's claim. In kitchens and barracks and mule paths, men spoke his name as if it were a road back to a world less complicated. Maria Christina felt the draft from those doors and set her shoulder against them, smiling in public and calculating in private. She could read a map of loyalties in the way a messenger's boots held mud from which province. The court remembered Ferdinand in fragments, his jealous guarding of rooms, his appetite for privacy, the tremor that signed away tomorrow to save today. Those fragments assembled themselves into rumour, and rumour hardened into explanation. The king's bed had made a battlefield. If a man's embraces are bargains, people will audit his heirs like accounts. Maria Christina learned to receive condolences for policies she had not written. and resistance she had not summoned. She invited bishops to dine under softer lamps. She arranged tutors for Isabella, whose voices would carry steady across the storm. She instructed servants to leave doors intentionally ajar. What was overheard was sometimes more persuasive than what was announced. Meanwhile, riders moved like punctuation across the countryside, commas of hesitation, exclamation points of revolt, a long ellipsis of waiting. In a print shop off a narrow Madrid street, a press creaked like an old ship. Ink smelled of iron and future. Pamphlets argued with authority, then hid under bread in baskets bound for the provinces. The regent's officials inspected fonts as if typefaces had opinions, which, in a sense, they did. Words marched into the world in tidy columns and came back as crowds with stones in their fists. Maria Christina, who understood that paper can be a fuse, tried another chemistry. Clemency mixed with example. A printer forgiven here, a pamphleteer banished there, a soldier promoted from the ranks for loyalty that smelled like courage rather than flattery. She hired a portraitist to paint Isabella not as a jewel, but as a child reaching for a book. Sentiment, she knew, is a ladder on which policy can climb, but the past worked against her. People remembered Ferdinand's hidden audiences, his velvet screens, the visitors whose names were folded into the air. They whispered that if a king teaches a country to seek truth behind doors, the country will keep seeking even when the doors change hands. The Queen signed edicts in a careful hand and went to bed late, listening for hoofbeats that told her which way the wind had decided to blow. In Navarre's folded hills, a captain named Zumalacárregui taught men to move like weather. They were Carlists who believed in the simplicity of straight lines, a brother after a brother, a law that did not bend when a crib contained a girl. They bled efficiently and sang without ornament. Their boots learned the rhythm of ambush, and their prayers kept count of cartridges. The regent heard their name like a cough in a neighbouring room that becomes a diagnosis. Ferdinand's shadow lengthened in every briefing. Advisers who had nodded at his secrecy now warned the Queen against her own. She received them with gratitude and ignored them when necessary. The art of rule is often the art of pretending you have not already decided. She courted generals with money, magistrates with honour, towns with grain, and found that each accepted the gift and remained unconvinced. The first skirmishes were local and brutal, not yet history, only pain. A farm that had yesterday baked bread now boiled bandages. A chapel that had sanctified marriages now blessed rifles. Women learned to count the gone by the weight of their sleep. And still, in some houses, a portrait of Ferdinand hung beside a portrait of the Virgin, the two gazes meeting over the table like a shameful secret the family had decided not to discuss. Court life learned austerity, exchanging silk for wool and ceremony for logistics. The regent's council table crowded with supply lists, petitions, betrayals. A nobleman who had performed wit like a lute now performed loyalty like a ledger. Maria Christina invited him to speak and watched which details he omitted. Omissions are the royal road to truth. In the nursery, Isabella's lessons braided history with handwriting, while beyond the windows, history unbraided itself into smoke. Ferdinand's sealed drawers yielded letters that did not improve anyone's sleep. They hinted at favours granted in the hush between sins and sacraments, debts owed not in coin, but in discretion. The Queen read them with a scholar's patience and a widow's anger, then returned them to their envelopes. To publish would be a fire, to suppress would be a slow mould. She chose the middle path, strategic leaks that stained reputations already damp. At Mass, she felt the pressure of gazes. Some prayed for her, some prayed against her, many prayed simply to survive the week. Outside the city, a bridge stood guarded, then abandoned, then guarded again, like a promise that could not settle on its own meaning. A widow from Andalusia arrived with a story that sounded useful. She had known a gentleman who had known a chamberlain who had kept a key. She named evenings and stairwells, described a king's laugh softening in a private room, and produced a ring as if memory had a jewel box. The regent received her with courtesy, had the ring weighed, and learned that fraud is heavier than it looks. Still, the tale had teeth. It bit into the city's appetite, the way sweet cakes bite into hunger, without satisfying it. The story marched where soldiers could not, slipped through checkpoints made of disbelief, reached priests too careful to believe in anything not written on vellum. Maria Christina understood that the truth was a draft others would revise. She let the widow talk, then paid her to leave, then paid someone else to follow her. The report that came back smelled of stage perfume. Ferdinand, silent in his portrait, offered no defense. The Queen, who needed the past to stop throwing stones at her windows, added the ring to a drawer of counterweights, favors to be owed, debts to be called, silences to be purchased. Letters from the north began to sound like weather reports. Fog in the valley, skirmish near the pass, powder low, spirits mixed. A general loyal to the regent wrote that victory required a story as much as it required gunpowder. "Give me a tale," he said, "that allows a tired man to stand." Maria Christina asked her chaplains for parables that could march, and they provided saints who had endured and queens who had prevailed with prudence. She trimmed the miracles and kept the morals. Meanwhile, Don Carlos's proclamations arrived on stiff paper that smelled of authority and damp cellars. They promised a restoration so perfect it could only exist in the past. Villages chose sides the way men choose hats, according to shape, shade, and who is looking. The regent sent grain with one hand and orders with the other, then leaned her forehead against the cool of a window and allowed herself 5 breaths of sorrow before returning to the table. The ghosts of Ferdinand's private life still paced. A dismissed lady-in-waiting sold a letter that hinted at more than chastity would approve. A former confessor hinted back. The Queen let the public tire itself on the gossip, then buried it with a new proclamation about taxes that enraged everyone equally. Winter enlarged everything. Distances, debts, doubts. Fires ate wood faster than budgets allowed, and soldiers learned the art of doing without. Maria Christina visited the hospital cloisters with their clean cold air and iron beds. She moved among the wounded as if arranging a difficult room, straightening a blanket here, asking a name there, allowing her hand to rest on a burning forehead long enough for memory to keep it. A rumour spread that she wept when she reached the courtyard, and another rumour contradicted it, and both helped. Back at the palace, an archivist brought her a packet sealed during Ferdinand's early reign. Inside lay a thin braid of hair, a miniature portrait, and a note that did not quite say what it meant. The Queen stared at the objects, as if they were relics of a saint whose miracles had misfired. She replaced them carefully, resealed the packet, and whispered to the past that it had had its turn. Don Carlos gathered strength where the mountains taught men to be narrow and tall. The regent's generals begged for decisive battles. The land preferred indecisive ones. Isabella practiced her letters and asked why some words are longer than the things they name. Her tutor answered that some needs require more syllables than bread. Spring returned like a negotiator, unfurling green terms along the hedgerows. The Regent's Council proposed an amnesty with teeth. Lay down arms and keep your home. Refuse and lose your harvest. Priests were enlisted as messengers, millers as jurors, midwives as envoys, for they knew every door and its true hinges. The offer moved along lanes where rifles had moved and found, in some places, a tired welcome. But tired peace is brittle. A magistrate, who remembered Ferdinand's private suppers with the fervour of a man denied, spoke poison in a tavern and called it loyalty. He suggested that illegitimate promises breed illegitimate heirs. The phrase travelled faster than horses. Maria Christina, hearing it repeated in a dozen careful versions, decided to answer without reply. She staged a procession in which Isabella rode not like a saint on a platform, but like a small rider on a small horse, waving at women who recognized themselves in her mother's fatigue. The city softened for an afternoon. Even those who simmered with other loyalties allowed their shoulders to drop. Night came, however, as it always does, and the counting of the dead resumed, and the bells rehearsed their old lessons. A siege teaches patience to those who survive it. In a northern town with stout walls and fewer barrels than courage, the loyalist commander hoarded powder and jokes, telling his men that laughter shortens cold. Inside the church, the statue of a martyr wore a shawl. Outside, the Carlists tightened their belt of earth. Messages flew like sparrows at dusk, disappearing into the same sky. Maria Christina traced the town's name with her finger on the map until the paper grew thin. Ferdinand's scandals, those private negotiations that had paid for an hour by mortgaging a year, returned as arithmetic. The treasury learned to subtract promises. The Queen asked the banker to stay for supper, and he did, and found that the soup tasted of policy. He left with a pledge wrapped in silk and hammered into silver the next morning. In the besieged town, a child learned the weight of silence and then the weight of a loaf, discovering which was heavier. A window broke and was repaired with a sermon pages. The commander wrote, "We can hold if we are remembered." The regent remembered him with a convoy whose wheels sang loudly on stones. The theatre reopened because even war must blink. The regent understood that a play can discipline a city better than a patrol if the actors choose their lines wisely. A comedy in which a foolish uncle insists on an antique law drew laughter that landed like a decision. The censors trimmed their quills. The audience repeated the best lines in markets and drew the moral home themselves. Across the river, a Carlist recruiter called the performance blasphemy against tradition, and his recruits nodded as if tradition had just bought them boots. In a back box, the Queen sat behind a thin silk and allowed herself to enjoy competence, the tight weave of cues, the hinge-perfect closing of doors, the clean unrolling of a story that did not surprise its own ending. She imagined a country that worked like this stage. Then the curtain fell, and the applause felt like rain on a roof, and she returned to her seat at the council table where nothing closed as neatly. Ferdinand had loved performances too, but his were smaller rooms with fewer witnesses. He had rehearsed affection and authority until they overlapped. The city, remembering, guarded its laughter from cruelty by aiming it elsewhere. A courier arrived from Rome with letters that folded like knives and opened like fans. The Holy See weighed the quarrel with the gravity of centuries and the flexibility of today. Blessings were distributed with the tact of a banker opening accounts on both sides of a street. Maria Christina received the words with gratitude and the understanding that a conditional benediction is a leash. She replied with phrases that sparkled like water and meant, in their depths, "Do not choose against me." At home, Isabella rehearsed bows until they looked like motions of the heart. The Queen taught her to listen to people's first adjectives. Those are the truths they think they are hiding. A gardener brought in out-of-season roses grown against a convent wall. The regent thanked him and thought about walls. News from the front broke like crockery and was glued each morning by clerks. The Carlists gained, the Loyalists held, the map changed clothes again. The Queen put down her pen and looked at the sky as if it might offer punctuation. It did not, but it did not contradict her, which, some days, was nearly the same as support. The mountain passes were still snowed in when a rumour slid over them like a fox. It said that Don Carlos had seen a sign in a red dawn. It said that the regent had fainted at news of a defeat. It said. A shepherd repeated none of it, preferring the honest conversation of bells. In the palace, the rumour arrived wearing velvet and was shown politely to a chair where it spread its skirts and demanded chocolate. Maria Christina gave it none. She set a small feast of facts on the table and invited the rumour to starve. A town held. A convoy arrived. A treaty with a minor prince matured into usefulness. She spoke softly so that those who wished for her failure would have to lean in, exposing their intent. Those who leaned too far found themselves without chairs when she rose. Meanwhile, Isabella outgrew a dress and asked if nations do the same. The Queen thought of Ferdinand, whose garments had been tailored for moods rather than for years, and answered that some nations learn to alter, while others prefer to burst their seams. The Queen moved through corridors as if the air itself might repeat her footsteps. After midnight, when the palace's breath grew slow, a door opened onto a smaller life. Agustin Muñoz, young, discreet, with a soldier's patience, waited in a room that had once been a music closet. He spoke softly, not as a courtier, but as a man who understood roofs, bread, and the price of kindness. The regent had buried a king and married a country. Now she permitted herself a human hour that no country would forgive. A priest with hands that shook arranged the vows in a whisper, stacking the sacrament beneath the throne like a hidden beam. Secrecy is masonry. It holds until heat and pressure find the crack. The Queen believed she could carry both love and rule if she kept them in separate rooms. Yet servants see what doors remember, and the city can read a face that has slept. Letters began to travel without signatures, suggestive, careful, eager to be believed. She answered with work, thinking that diligence might rinse rumour from the day. The child Isabella slept with a doll in her arms, while in a room 2 courtyards away, her mother chose a life that would require 1,000 denials. In the morning, she signed decrees with an unshaking hand and told herself that a secret, guarded well, becomes a kind of prayer. A nation held together by proclamations needs a new grammar. The Estatuto Real arrived like a carefully hemmed garment, not as free as some wanted, not as tight as others would tolerate. It promised chambers that would talk and a crown that would listen, though no one agreed on what listening meant. Maria Christina presented it as healing cloth to bind an old wound. The opposition measured the stitches and counted how much skin still showed. Ministers learned to bow to 2 clocks, the slow one that governed laws and the fast one that governed events. The Queen read reports over broth. Her private happiness folded into the napkin on her lap. She thought of Ferdinand, who had trusted doors more than people, and tried to do the opposite without being seen doing it. The Estatuto pleased the moderates, angered the zealots, and bored the tired. In other words, it functioned. In a chapel, she asked the Virgin to bless an arrangement that was not a covenant, but would have to serve like one. Outside, the city evaluated liberty the way a cat evaluates a bowl of milk. Curious, suspicious, then suddenly thirsty. Money is the marrow of wars and governments. Enter Mendizábal, with accounts like maps, and a gaze that measured waste as a sin. He spoke in ledgers, and listened in deficits. The regent, who had learned the arithmetic of rumour, now learned the mathematics of survival. Desamortization, disentailment, was his liturgy. Take stone from idle hands, turn it into bread and bullets, and let the future thank you later, or curse you efficiently. Convents stirred. Cloisters that had kept the silence of centuries found themselves discussed in markets where onions argued with salt. Mendizábal's plan promised auctions and coined piety into coin. It also promised enemies who prayed loudly. Maria Christina signed the papers and felt the air cool. The church's gaze rearranged itself upon her like armour. In private, She held Munoz's hand and asked whether good deeds can be done with rough tools. He answered as soldiers answer, "Purpose sharpens edges." She returned to her desk and wrote to commanders that victory requires boots, and boots require leather, and leather requires money. Let the miracles arrive by ledger. War selects its saints and then spends them. Zumala Karagi, the Carlist blade honed by mountains, moved like a rumour you could not quite catch. At Bilbao's relief, he took a wound that looked small and spoke large. Doctors argued in low voices while the men outside counted reasons to keep breathing. The commander's face greyed in a way that told soldiers their own futures. A leader is a road. When it washes out, you must choose between turning back and falling in. Maria Christina heard the news as a sequence of nouns: wound, fever, decline. She did not rejoice, she recalculated. An enemy's death does not end a war. Often it merely removes a clarity. The Carlists mourned with clenched teeth and greater zeal, proving that grief can be a forge. At night, the regent dreamed of staircases, some going up, some down, all slippery. She woke and wrote instructions in a neat hand so that morning would be guided by something steadier than sleep. Summer flared, and so did anger. In a city of factories and bells, mobs burst like blisters. Convent doors were battered, altars fell to the same hammer that breaks wheels. Flames wrote their careless script across rafters, while some cried justice, and some cried revenge, and most merely cried. The Queen, who had signed papers that turned cloisters into coins, watched the unintended sermon of fire and felt the burn come back up her own sleeve. She sent troops with orders tied to their scabbards. Protect lives first, then stones. The clergy's prayers rose through smoke with a bitter frankincense. Mendizábal paged through destruction like a man paging through accounts, calculating that hysteria shortens patience for reform. The Queen arranged public penance without admitting fault, a choreography learned from older kings who had also misjudged the elasticity of crowds. At night she knelt and asked the Virgin whether mercy can be learned backwards, from riot to restraint. Outside the city cooled, ash falling like tired snow. Disentailment moved from decree to hammer-stroke. Auction rooms smelled of paper, sweat, and old varnish. Lands that had once received pilgrims now received surveyors. Cloister gardens sprouted ledgers. Some buyers were peasants blinking at luck. Others were men whose hands never dirty themselves and whose boots never lack shine. The Queen insisted on rules that would favour the first group, knowing that rules, like riverbanks, are admired until they hold back someone's boat. The church protested with the stately outrage of a cathedral bell. Bishops drafted letters heavy with centuries. The regent answered with years, counting bread, bullets, salaries paid on time. She met privately with a grave abbot who spoke of souls, and she promised to feed the bodies that housed them. He left unconvinced, but less inclined to thunder. At home, Munoz read aloud a page of travel tales to untie the day from her shoulders. She listened, saw none of the landscapes, and thanked him all the same. La Granja in summer promised fountains and delivered thunder. Soldiers loyal to liberty marched their boots right up the palace steps and made a request phrased as an ultimatum. Restore the old constitution or watch the season change to something harsher. The regent's face did not alter. Inside she counted doors. She had believed she could trim power without uprooting it. The gardeners had come with axes. She signed, because there are signatures that save children. The 1812 Constitution, stubborn, ringing, uncompromising, returned like a hymn everyone knows. The Queen accepted the melody and resolved to conduct it rather than be drowned by it. That night, in a small room far from the fountains, she pressed her forehead to the cool plaster and wondered whether love can survive revolutions conducted at one's own window. Munoz counselled patience. His hand held hers as if anchoring a boat. Outside, The troops sang until hoarseness ate the song, then slept under stars as if they had earned them. A new Cortes gathered under the creak of benches and the glow of purpose. The 1837 Constitution was hammered into balance. Crown trimmed but not broken. Chambers louder but not rowdy. Rights pronounced with a careful tongue. The regent learned to speak in constitutional clauses, which is to say she learned the art of guided weather. Espartero's name began to travel on soldiers' breath, attached to victories that made maps easier to look at. In galleries, whispers counted votes before the votes were cast. The Queen smiled at men whose grandfathers would have preferred to kneel. She embraced a public self that had no space for secrets, and in that public light, her private vows cast a longer shadow. She learned to step over them without looking down. Isabella, older now, copied lines from a history of queens who had ruled like bridges, bearing weight, swaying just enough not to break. She asked if bridges get tired. Her tutor replied that they do, but they are allowed no knees. The Carlist court moved like a camp that refused to admit it was a camp. Don Carlos kept a royal stiffness in rooms that smelled of leather and rain. Beside him stood men who believed compromises are sins, and others who believed sins can be baptized if they look like victories. General Maroto, clever and tired, counted provisions and illusions with equal rigor. He disliked both shortages. Purges began as whispers and ended as volleys. Executions at dawn clarified nothing, as dawn seldom does. The Queen's agents reported that fervour had eaten hierarchy, leaving zealots to dine on one another. She did not rejoice. She moved pieces on the board made of roads and fords. When an enemy simplifies himself, you must complicate with mercy or finish with steel. She chose both, in alternating measures, as the weather permitted. At night, Don Carlos prayed aloud, a man sincere in his error or correct in a world unfit for his correctness. History has trouble telling the difference when blood is fresh. The royal expedition gathered itself like a storm and rolled toward Madrid. Don Carlos believed that proximity to the capital would teach the city its duty. The city believed walls are wiser than hopes. The Carlist columns arrived close enough to taste the dust of the road that leads to the palace, then discovered that roads can end in refusal. Loyalist forces, scattered and stitched, pulled tight at the last moment. The expedition saluted the city with artillery and received in return the cold nod of endurance. Maria Christina watched from within, measuring distances with a mother's dread. She understood that victory's face is sometimes merely the absence of disaster. After several sharp days, the expedition withdrew, carrying its certainty like a relic grown awkward to hold. Children in Madrid learned a new game, running to a gate and then running back, laughing, so near, so near. Their parents did not laugh. The palace learned to fold babies' cries into its music again. The regent's secret household grew. Tiny hands, sudden laughter, the soft labour of love. Munoz moved with the care of a man walking across a frozen river, steady, measured, testing each step. Servants loyal by affection rather than rank became the scaffolding of concealment. The Queen kept two ledgers in her heart, one of the realm, one of her children, and prayed their sums would not collide. But collisions are the most patient forces in politics. A courtier who hated reform more than he loved truth collected details with the thrift of a miser. A carriage scene at an odd hour, a physician's frequent visits to a door not on any plan. He fed his collection to those who like their virtue salted with scandal. The regent answered with dignity so precise it almost looked like innocence. Almost. She scheduled public devotions, sponsored orphan dowries, and walked slow circuits through hospital wards, letting gratitude gild her reticence. Still, The whispering tried new keys. The queen discovered that silence is a rope, beautiful in a bell tower, deadly around a throat. Espartero's victories wrote their names across rivers. At Luchana, the ice-thick water carried away doubt, and Bilbao breathed again. The general's fame began to wear the shape of inevitability, which is a dangerous cut for any statesman. Maria Christina recognized a sword that can one day be pointed at the hand that awarded it. She honored him, supplied him, and measured him, as one measures a bridge before the flood season. In councils, men wore his name as a cloak. In barracks, soldiers wore it as a talisman. The queen sought balance by promoting competence where it hid shyly and pruning arrogance where it sprouted like weeds. She wrote to Espartero in a tone that mixed gratitude with homework. He replied in paragraphs that smelled of campfire and rain. Isabella asked whether heroes are always safe to keep. The regent replied that heroes are like stallions, magnificent in motion, difficult in stables. Courtiers invented a new proverb: 2 crowns live under one roof, the crown of the state and the crown of a child's brow. Isabella learned the steps of ceremony as if they were multiplication tables, unskippable, precise, sometimes meaningless until needed. The regent watched her daughter's gaze settle into the habit of distance that the well-loved learn early to survive scrutiny. A doll's coronation took place on a carpet. Applause was limited to a governess's smile. Meanwhile, the war continued to sew and unsew the map. The queen visited a workshop where uniforms were mended. She thanked a seamstress who pricked her finger and did not bleed in public. "Your Majesty," the woman said, "cloth lies still. Men do not." The regent carried the sentence away like a needle. At night, Munoz told the children a story about a fisherman who knew the names of winds. The regent listened from the doorway, and for a moment, rooms were just rooms, not corridors to judgment. Atrocities are arguments that refuse to speak. In valleys where orchards should have been at ease, villagers buried neighbours with unblessed speed. A loyalist patrol found a farmhouse nailed with grief. A Carlist patrol found a ditch that taught the same lesson. Priests ran out of words and then used them anyway. The Queen's proclamations called for restraint, and the war laughed and continued. Espartero ordered discipline with the steel of a man who knows chaos too well. Don Carlos condemned what his captains could not always prevent. Mercy, where it appeared, looked tired, like a soldier who has marched too long but refuses to sit because the ground is wet. Maria Christina signed a decree for the care of widows and orphans, aware that paper cannot raise the dead but can sometimes rescue the living from the riverbank. She slept little and dreamed of doors opening into fields of wheat, not into rooms full of voices. General Maroto grew heavier with conclusions. He counted his king's chances and measured them against his men's lives and found the balance insulting. He executed rivals whose zeal promised defeat. The shot echoes rolled down the streets of Estella and woke Europe enough to listen. Then he sent messages with white space between the lines. Spaces Espartero read with relief. The regent felt a hinge give somewhere in the north. Negotiation is a bridge built while 2 armies watch. Envoys crossed with courtesies first, terms later. Honor was weighed like grain, adjusted by a finger on the scale. Commissions preserved, conscience appeased, the future given just enough dignity to endure. Don Carlos frowned at arithmetic done with hearts. His captains counted differently. Maroto proceeded, a man willing to be called traitor by those he refused to lead to certain death. Maria Christina prayed not for victory, but for the kind of peace that can be taught to children. 2 men met, and the war lost its appetite. The Abrazo de Vergara, Espartero and Maroto, arms encircling honor rather than throats, offered amnesty like bread and rank like salt. Muskets lowered. Drums remembered how to be barrels. Carlist officers slid into Spain's future with their heads still high. their monarch abandoned to a purer, lonelier dream. Maria Christina received the news in a quiet that thundered. She thanked God in the old phrases and Espatero in the new, and then asked for lists, names to be restored, families to be found, regiments to be fed. In the city, bells rang as if newly cast. In the mountains, men learned how to be civilians again, which is harder than marching. The Queen stood on a balcony and waved, then retreated before the cheer could turn into an expectation she could not meet. Peace, like a guest, must be welcomed and also politely managed. Peace does not dismiss all captains. In the east, Cabrera kept the war's ember in his fist and blew until the hills glowed again. Villagers listened with tilted heads, asking whether the lull had been a truce or a trick. Maria Christina, newly steadied by the accord, felt the floor tilt beneath her shoes. She had held a nation together with cord and prayer. Now threads frayed where maps still wrinkled. Espartero wrote that he would put his boot on the ember. Cabrera wrote that embers are lessons the wind refuses to forget. The regent knew that what ends in one province merely turns a corner in the next. She sent commissaries with patience and powder and asked them to spend the first before the second. Some did. Most did not. Isabella practiced signatures on blank paper, while her tutors placed beneath it a sheet of faint lines that taught the hand how to be sober. She traced letters that would one day bind men who now would not be bound. Ferdinand's portrait watched. The rooms remembered his talent for postponement and whispered it to anyone who lingered in them. The Queen tried the opposite. Decisions made early, announced late, executed quietly. It is difficult to teach a country new habits when its memories keep walking in. The quarrel over towns arrived dressed as law. Who would choose the alcaldes, Madrid, or the neighbours who knew the weight of each man's handshake? The municipal law coiled itself around the councils like a new vine around an old wall. Maria Christina, who feared 1,000 small sovereignties more than one bristling capital, favoured the wall. The Cortes, tuned to newer music and louder plazas, favoured the vine. Between them stood Espartero, courteous as a bridge, and just as noisy when armies crossed. Pamphlets argued municipal virtue. Sermons compared local pride to mustard seeds that move mountains and sometimes merely sting noses. The Queen counted votes and found that arithmetic had joined the enemy. She softened the law and hardened her face. The moderation satisfied no one, which is often what moderation is for. At a window, Isabella asked why streets are named after saints and not after bakers. Her governess answered that saints feed souls and bakers feed bellies. Then we need both, the child said, turning back to her copywork as if the problem were solved. Spain learned a new word pronounced with drums, juntas. In Barcelona, Zaragoza, Madrid, they sprouted overnight like weeds encouraged by rain and insult. Citizens who had once whispered learned to speak from balconies to crowds that raised their faces like sunflowers. Espartero's prestige fed the movement without his leave. His name flew on banners he had not stitched. The regent discovered that gratitude is not obedience and that memory of war victories is coin men like to spend against crowns. She tried to braid the strands, a concession here, a postponement there, a reshuffling of ministers as if the same cards might produce a cleaner hand. The plazas answered with songs, sometimes sweet, sometimes shaped like stones. A colonel saluted with one hand and drafted a pronunciamiento with the other. Isabella watched from an upper window and counted hats instead of heads to lessen the weight of the scene. At night, Maria Christina walked the corridors alone and thought of Ferdinand's velvet secrecy, how he had believed doors were allies. Her own doors seemed to be voting. There comes a moment when a queen must choose the crown or the country, and sometimes the choice is to step aside so that both survive the night. At La Granja and then Madrid, pressure pressed until it became geometry, one direction only. Maria Christina resigned the regency with a pen that did not tremble. She kissed Isabella, who smelled of chalk and orange peel, and told her that some guardianship is best given from a distance. The decree named a council until the Cortes could name a single hand. The corridors grew suddenly longer. She left Spain by the same roads on which she had arrived years before, now in a carriage that carried both dignity and rumour. With her went the truth of a secret marriage that had long been everybody's rumour and nobody's responsibility. Muñoz sat across from her, a presence built for usefulness and for love. When the lamps swayed in the coach, he braced the glass with his palm. In the city, people said the word regent, as if it were a bell that had cracked. Espartero stood where history asked him to, and did not decline. Paris received exiles the way the sea receives rivers, without questions and with a taste of salt. Maria Christina found rooms that looked at a grey ribbon of water and decided that the city's indifference was a mercy. The truth of her marriage to Muñoz, properly blessed but privately endured, unfolded into daylight and acquired the plain dignity that daylight grants. She became for a season a woman with 3 tasks: to mother by letter, to love without marches or ministries, and to wait for Spain to remember what she had done right. Rumours repainted her anyway. A queen abroad is a canvas for other people's designs. Some saw scheming, some saw sacrifice. Most saw a story they could tell at supper. She learned to go out at odd hours, to let the Seine teach her a slower grammar, to forgive the shopkeepers who recognized her and did not bow. Letters from Madrid smelled of wax and intent. Espartero governed like a general and negotiated like one. Europe watched to see if he would learn softer verbs. Isabella's hand grew steadier. The child wrote that she missed the garden where fountains jumped like laughter. Espartero accepted the regency as a campaign with different weather. He drilled ministries, rationed patronage like powder, and expected applause to march in step. At first the nation obliged. Progressives saw in him a clean line. Moderates saw an interruption they could endure if the roads improved. He cut through snarls with a soldier's knife and left tidy ends that did not always knit. Factories coughed, guilds argued with mills, the ports kept their own counsel. The Regent General answered with tariffs and treaties, with firings worded as reforms. He believed that if he walked straight, the country would become a road beneath him. Spain believed otherwise. Yet for a season the map behaved, and the letters from abroad addressed him with admiration edged by warning. In the old palace rooms, Ferdinand's shade seemed to lean against the mantel, amused that someone else now tried to govern men the way one governs troops. The walls, which had stored a century of breath, exhaled the same advice to every wearer of the sash: listen before you order. Barcelona bristled. Looms spoke too loudly. Wages whispered back. Politics borrowed the city's accent and sharpened it. A disturbance became a barricade became a principle met artillery. Espartero, who had sworn to keep Spain intact, ordered the guns. The bombardment cut sentences out of the city, leaving ellipses where houses had been. Victory tasted of smoke, and the Regency learned what power learns when it corrects with fire, that fear obeys but does not admire. Maria Christina, reading the dispatch in Paris, closed her eyes and saw Aranjuez again. Rooms where authority had also mistaken force for solution. Isabella, still a girl, read only that a city she had once drawn in her atlas had been hurt. She folded the page like a bandage. The mills resumed. The people resumed. Resumption is not the same as repair. Pronunciamientos reheated the air. Generals who once saluted began to write letters that bowed while disobeying. O'Donnell in one province, Narvaez in another, each with a cadence that promised steadiness after the thunder. Espartero marched to tame them and found that roads grow longer when patience grows short. The Cortes learned to count differently. Embassies measured whether the regent general's shadow had started to shorten. In taverns, the people traded weather reports disguised as news. This town declared that garrison wavered, that city opened its gates at dawn with a weary shrug. A child queen waited at the hinge of the door between minority and rain. Maria Christina wrote that storms sometimes clear the sky for small stars to be seen. She did not add that storms can also blow roofs away. By summer's end, the country preferred a quieter face. Espartero boarded a ship with the dignity of a man who has lost a battle without losing his profession. Spain inhaled as if a tight bandage had been loosened. Madrid dressed a child in majesty. Isabella, scarcely 13, received the kingdom like a chalice 2 sizes too large. The Cortes hurried the ceremony with arguments called reasons. Narvaez stood close enough to be useful, far enough to be indispensable. The city applauded with that mixture of tenderness and calculation reserved for weddings and coronations. The new queen blinked under the diamonds and told herself that a steady chin is a kind of courage. Maria Christina, no longer regent, but never merely absent, watched from France with a mother's hand on a railing until her knuckles ached. She sent a necklace with a note that said nothing and meant everything. The girl who had learned to sign beneath faint guidelines now signed above them. Power shifted to moderates who preferred order to enthusiasm. They stacked ministries like tidy shelves and promised that the house would now stay clean. Outside, dust continued to be made. Order arrived with creases sharp enough to cut. Narvaez kept a clean desk and a short list of tolerated surprises. Ministries learned to write in the mood of permanence. Journals learned to read between lines. Maria Christina returned discreetly, not as a sovereign, but as a mother whose counsel fit into the pauses of conversations. She smiled, and did not count how many smiled back because the count would have been wrong anyway. Funds moved, concessions sprouted. The word speculation acquired both admirers and accusers. The Queen signed projects that promised roads to quieter futures, while courtiers built smaller roads to their own doors. Spain, like a large house, echoed with footsteps that hurried without appearing to run. Isabella learned the ceremonial courage of nodding through doubts. At night she watched the moon lean over the palace gardens and wished that certainty arrived with daylight like dew. It did not. It arrived like carriages at dusk, one after another, each with a different face. Marriage turned into a chessboard on which Europe leaned elbows. Britain preferred one groom, France another. Spain preferred to be left alone and was not. Maria Christina understood the arithmetic. A husband must guard the throne's quiet, multiply heirs, divide no factions, and subtract foreign meddling. Such men are rare even in fables. Suitors arrived as portraits and pedigrees, each framed by consequences. Narvaez wanted stability that did not wake the barracks at midnight. Diplomats poured sugared logic into crystal cups and found the Queen polite but firm. Isabella's heart, trained to be a listener, gave no public advice. Her mother laid before her pictures and prayed with the frantic stillness of those who have no leverage left but love. In an antechamber, a court painter sighed and mixed a shade of blue that he kept having to repaint, because alliances changed between sittings. The wedding bells carried 2 melodies. Isabella married Francisco de Assis. Her sister, Luisa Fernanda, married the Duke of Montpensier. Spain received both unions with cheers carefully phrased. Europe translated them into French and English and read between lines. Maria Christina had arranged the pieces with one eye on Paris, one on Madrid, and a third eye that every mother grows when her child is placed under a crown. The ceremonies glittered. The private music faltered. Compatibility, that shy bird, refused to land decisively. Courtiers resumed their favourite game, arithmetic disguised as sympathy. The queen smiled and discovered that smiles can be a kind of penance. Narvaez called for calm and pledged that the state would stay in its lane while everyone else learned theirs. In the streets, fireworks wrote promises that fell as ash. In kitchens, women said that a good husband needs to be a good season, steady, nourishing, never cruel. The palace heard and stored the proverb among its other collections. After the bells, the house learns what it has married. Isabella's days arranged themselves around ceremonies that tried to become habits. Nights arranged themselves around silences that tried to become customs. The queen worked, signed, and appeared. The king consort perfected the art of presence that stirs no ripples. Whispers tried different doors, found some closed, some ajar, and rewarded themselves with invention. Maria Christina counseled discretion, as if teaching a child to carry a glass brimming with milk across a crowded room. She knew how quickly a stumble becomes a song in the streets. The young queen discovered that affection is not a law, and that patience, when forced, turns bitter on the tongue. She looked at the portraits of women who had done better with worse and asked them for their recipes. The portraits, being paint, kept their secrets. Outside, the moderates kept the roads open and the presses correct. Inside, the crown learned again that private storms leak. In Catalonia and the Maestrazgo, old banners found new staffs. The Second Carlist War did not thunder. It hissed, flared, receded, and stung. Cabrera returned with the patience of a wolf testing fences. Villages that had promised never again remembered the taste of again. The moderates cursed softly and requisitioned loudly. The queen signed orders with a hand that had learned steadiness the hard way. Spain now owned railways in drawings and factories in dreams. Modernity sniffed around the door, but did not yet come in to sit. The fighting remained a countryside quarrel with city consequences. Taxes, levies, lists of names that did not return for supper. Maria Christina advised firmness with mercy, which is to say difficulty with difficulty. Cabrera's letters to his men sounded like psalms and like ledgers. Espartero's name, even in exile, still had the power to make officers breathe differently. Narvaez's presence made them stand straighter. The queen chose gravity over glitter and waited for the ember to cool without blowing ash into her own lungs. Fortunes grow opinions. Contracts issued in good faith acquired margins in bad light. Names that had been merely successful became accused of being too successful. Maria Christina's household investments drew gossip the way sweet cakes draw flies. She had lived too long with scarcity to mistrust a full pantry, yet she recognized the speed with which gratitude curdles into suspicion when coins change pockets. Narvaez defended order with a vocabulary of firmness. The opposition borrowed the same nouns and pointed them at him. The queen, between a mother's interests and a sovereign's conscience, tried to keep both clean. She learned that soap, in politics, is expensive and sometimes flammable. A petition arrived from women whose sons had disappeared into skirmishes that were not wars. They wrote with a grammar of cries turned into sentences. Isabella answered with money and with a visit. Both helped and neither healed. Isabella learned that sovereignty is a posture learned daily. She cultivated audiences where she listened to 3 sentences longer than custom required. Ambassadors told their capitals that the queen was ripening into her part. Friends told one another that ripening sometimes bruises. The consort maintained an archipelago of rooms where ceremonies slept lightly and woke when summoned. Maria Christina urged her daughter to cultivate the gardener's arts. Prune without apology, water without waste, and never show the shears unless necessary. The queen tried, and sometimes the cut was too deep, sometimes the water too little, sometimes the shears were seen. Spain kept breathing, which is how success and failure often look from a distance. Theatres reopened not for morale this time, but for habit. A comedy played in which a woman rules her house with wisdom that hides in jokes. The audience laughed, and the queen laughed, and both recognized themselves without saying so. Memory became a profession. Pamphleteers reprinted the Mutiny of Aranjuez with fresh exclamation points. Painters redid Bayonne as if changing the color of the drapes would move the doors. Plays hinted without naming. Sermons named without hinting. Ferdinand's private bargains, marriages that were puzzles, hours that were rumors' blessed sacraments, returned as parables wielded against the present. Each new whisper in the palace was measured against an old one and found to rhyme. Isabella bristled and then did not. She learned that one cannot argue with a thunderstorm by raising one's voice. One closes the windows and waits. Maria Christina, who knew the shape of those storms, told her that endurance is not surrender, and that silence can be a sentence with a strong verb. Narvaez stacked calm like bricks. The opposition stacked anecdotes like kindling. The city waited to see which would catch. The crown tried a pilgrimage to quiet noise. Monasteries, towns, and garrisons received their sovereign with bread and brass bands. Isabella knelt. Veterans saluted. Children stared and forgot to wave until she had moved on, and then waved at her absence. Along the road, old women told the queen that the past sits down with you whether or not you set a place. She replied with a smile that meant she had already made room. In private, she visited a widow who showed her a locket containing a curl cut from a head long dead. He fought in the First War, the woman said, and his son in the Second. Is there to be a third? The queen said she did not intend it. Intentions are not barricades, but sometimes they are bridges. Back in Madrid, the palace smelled of dust warmed by summer. Maria Christina sat with her daughter at an open window. For a long time they did not speak. That, too, is a kind of counsel. Places remember better than people. Aranjuez still smelled of crushed leaves and decision. Bayonne still arranged its papers neatly. Valencia still kept its gravel paths ready for exile's footsteps. Madrid still rehearsed both cheers and silences. Isabella, now practiced in walking where her ancestors had stumbled, let each sight speak. At Aranjuez, she counted how many hands it takes to topple a favourite. At Bayonne, she read the air for traps set in politeness. At Valencia, she measured the distance between gilding and cage. In Madrid, she listened for the seam where celebration becomes demand. She understood then that the scandals that haunt a crown are not merely sins, but shortcuts. Places where desire outran ritual, where fear outran patience. Ferdinand had taken many such paths, some paved with necessity, some with vanity. Their footprints remained, and sometimes she found her own steps trying to fit them. Maria Christina watched her daughter note these things without writing them down. Lessons written on the heart are harder to misplace. Now the story draws its curtain with care. A crown is a mirror that remembers every face that leaned too near. It keeps the warmth of breaths long vanished. Ferdinand VII taught Spain to look for doors inside doors, to suspect the velvet as well as the iron. His bargains, struck at a whisper and sealed with a ring or a decree or a silence, did not die with him. They taught the palace how to expect its own shadows. Maria Christina learned to build in daylight and to love in rooms that could not survive inspection, and so the country inherited both her steadiness and her echo. Isabella learned to stand where the floor had once tilted, and to smile as if balance were a prayer one could speak with the body. Listen then as the palace grows quiet. The soldiers are in their barracks, the press is cool, the fountains remember their patterns. Outside, Spain goes on with bread and letters and babies who will learn new names for old weather. If scandals haunt the crown, it is because crowns are made to be haunted. They collect yesterdays as reliquaries collect bone. Yet the haunting softens. The corridors grow kind. The heavy portraits learn to be merely frames. Breathe. Let the doors close without slamming. Let the candles gutter and bless the darkness that follows. We have walked a long way through old rooms. Step out now into the night air, which smells of dust and jasmine and something like forgiveness. The bells, which once told warning, practice a gentler hour. Let the corridors empty now. Let the braziers cool and the gold fade to a comfortable dusk. We have walked the long house of a life, and the dust has settled where the silks once rustled, and the whispering has grown tired of itself. Breathe, and imagine the candles being pinched shut, one, then another, until only the scent of beeswax lingers. A king has passed across our view like a slow cloud, and the palace remembers him more as weather than as man. Gusts of temper, a hush of calculation, a rare bright clearing of tenderness when a child laughed. If scandal is a bell, it continues to sound after the rope is dropped, softer and softer, until it is only the gentle humming of metal returning to silence. In that quiet, we can let the old quarrels fold themselves neatly and slide back into their drawers. Look once more at the empty cradle now filled by sleep, at the letters stacked and tied with ribbon, at the window opened a finger's width to let the night in. The past is finished with us for this evening, and we with it. Close your eyes, slow your breathing, and set these rooms behind you like a shore receding, the sea smoothing every footprint, the air warm as a blessing, my voice a last small lantern going dim. Good night.